Hey guys, thanks for tuning back in. This is All Things Chess with Cybertel. I am Cybertel, also called John. We're going to continue our examination of isolated queen pawn themes. We're going to continue on with the specific theme of the pawn break d4, d5. Again, I think any strategic examination of a position has to start with the pawn breaks, so I think the study of d4, d5 is particularly apropos, because it is one of the most important themes in any isolated queen pawn position. We've got a main game to look at and sort of a sub-game within the game. d4, d5, it can often lead to attacking chances, but the main game that I selected also leads to a bit more of a quiet endgame, which oftentimes is the end result of a d4, d5 push, because it sort of liquidates the position down. But let's get to it. This is the game Joel Benjamin against Jonathan Grant. So this is a game in Great Britain in 2005. Joel Benjamin again, e4. Again, just to reinforce, isolated queen pawns can happen from nearly any opening, so it is incumbent upon you to get these themes on board. Black played c6. c4, this is one of many ways of getting an isolated queen pawn out of Caro-Kann opening. The other way, the main way, is d4, d5, take, and then c4. This is the Panafot-Vinnik against the Caro-Kann, and this will most certainly lead to an isolated queen pawn position, unless white plays c5, but that's another subject. So c4, just sort of an offbeat way of trying to get the structure that he's looking for. It's not necessarily better or worse, it's just a different way of playing. d5, ed, and we've got the structure that we're looking for. The boon to this move order for white is it sort of gets the structure that he's looking for while avoiding some particular move orders. So I'll point those out once we get to them here. So knight f3, e6, just an aside, and I will have videos about this after this isolated queen pawn series. At any point, black can transition into a hanging pawn position, so it's also very important to have those themes on board as well. We will examine those later, but just as a refresher, let's take the hanging pawns. Really, the most important squares for the hanging pawns are the pawns in front of hanging pawns, so just get those quickly on the board. In this position, the most important square on the board is c4. If white can control c4 or push his pawn to c4, it'll be a normal position. If black can somehow blockade that weak pawn in c3 by controlling the c4 square or directly occupying it, that can often mean an advantage for black. But just an aside, hanging pawn positions are integrally connected to isolated queen pawn positions, so you have to know both of them. But black doesn't do that. Black plays e6. Bishop c4. This is a clever way of avoiding a lot of stuff. d4 would be a more flexible move because it would leave the positioning of the bishop undiagnosed, but also black could take this opportunity to play bishop b4. And this is a fairly decent way of black responding to the structure. This is sort of a basic Nimzo-Indian-ish way of responding. So white plays bishop c4 to avoid bishop b4 and cut out a lot of theory that he has to know. So bishop c4, clever move, avoids a lot of theory from black. Knight c6, castle, bishop b7, rook e1. So this is a very basic position. You might remember from the last video, I'd mentioned that I preferred the bishop c4 lines to the bishop d3 lines because it puts a little bit more pressure on black's position immediately, so we'll get to look at that a little bit here. Again, rook e1, it's absolutely where the rook belongs. It's just the natural post in these isolated queen pawn positions. So white has very clear roles for all of his pieces. He has good space, he has good attacking chances. It's incumbent upon black to try to figure out a way to get his light square bishop involved. That's really the main issue for black in most of these positions. He needs to try to shore up the d5 point to keep that adequately protected so he doesn't experience that d4, d5 break. And he needs to keep his king side adequately protected. So for black, that's sort of a balancing job. He needs to choose moves that achieve at least a couple of those things, or try to balance all three at once. In the game, black chose knight f6. This is played by theory, but honestly I just don't think this is the correct move. It doesn't score particularly well. and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Thematically, in these isolated queen pawn positions, you want to be, one of the things you want to do is defend the d5 square, defend that potential outpost for your pieces. That just directly moves the blockade away. And it doesn't necessarily achieve anything. If you were achieving something by doing that, that would be one thing, but it's just moving the knight back to where it was in f6. So I don't think this is the appropriate move. Modern theory prefers bishop f6, and black is doing perfectly fine after this. Just quick look at the way theory looks at it. And there's some other options from here, but this is a fairly balanced position. White has the bishop pair. In return, black has found a very nice diagonal for his light squared bishop. That's usually a problem piece, but here it's very beautifully placed. And black can finish his development and try to pressure the isolated pawn on d4, and then white's free to try to generate attacking chances from here. So, balanced position, bishop f6, in my opinion, is just the best move. Another popular move, and this will be one that we look at probably in the next video, b6. This is surprisingly popular because it is a very well-known mistake. It is just flat out a poor move, but it's very popular, so I'm guessing that people get to this position by accident because it's not part of their repertoire, and then they play sort of a common sense-ish looking move without knowing the history or the theory behind it. The most prominent example of this being a mistake was the game Botvinnik-Alekhine in the Avro tournament in 1938. So this is a mistake with a pedigree behind it. We'll look at this game later on in the series, but just as a quick aside, this is the correct prescription against it, and white's just flat out better, because that b6 move has created some weaknesses that white's immediately exploiting. But knight f6, like I said, theory, it's played a lot, but I just don't think it's the best move here. So, a3, as we saw in the last video, a3 is a very common move in these structures. It gives the light square bishop a bolt hole, where it can drop back to either b3 or a2, depending on what black's resources are. Also, later on, it allows white to create that vital battery we saw last time, where his bishop is on either c2 or b1, and his queen is on d3. He wants to create that battery to create chances on the king side, to provoke a weakness that he can take advantage of. So, a3, very standard. a6, this isn't as good. This is a little bit profligate with time. It's not necessarily losing, but black is certainly behind in developments, and d5 is already a somewhat plausible move, so he needs to develop as quickly as possible. b6, this is, in my opinion, a better move, and it gives white two different options that he can look at. One is the more complicated attacking way. The other is the more thematic one to the for the theme of these videos. One option is d5. This isn't the best version of d5, but it's important to look at because it's very typical for these structures. d4-d5 isn't always going to be a knockout blow. It's not going to be like the last game we looked at where Smyslov crushed through and Karpov's position was completely broken. A lot of times if you choose d4-d5, you're going to be getting a slightly better endgame, which is exactly what white gets here. So I'll just give a quick line as an example. 2. This is fairly forced. There's a couple of different options, but then bishop g5. This is very thematic for what white tends to get out of these positions. He's not winning by force, certainly, but he's absolutely better. That pawn, black pawn on e6 is very weak, and it gives white a chance to sort of bear down and squeeze on that weakness. This is what they call playing for two results only. There's no way that white's going to lose this position. This is either going to be a white win or a white draw. If you like squeezing with no risk, this is the sort of position for you. If you like something more complicated, d5 isn't mandatory. White can play queen d3 here. And this sort of tries to keep the tension in the position so he can keep developing and either A, play d5 at a better spot down the road, or B, just continue with his kingside assaults. The game that I have listed actually does the former of those, waiting for d5 for a better moment. Bishop b7, bishop a2. Rook e8. We're following, in this game, Viganian leg key from the European 50+ Championship in 2016. A couple of these moves aren't great, but they're fairly typical for these structures. Bishop a2, it's an important point here. Bishop e3 is sometimes an idea here. Bishop a2 is better because it takes white out of range of knight a5. The point of the a3 move is to give that light-squared bishop a bolt hole where it can just shoot at black's kingside without being harassed. If you moved it back to bishop b3, the black could even play knight a5 immediately and just immediately harass that bishop on b3 where it has to move back, and then that gives black time to block the light-squared bishop out of the game, when black should be doing better here than he would in the game. Whereas bishop a2, there's no tempo from knight a5, so that would give white time to just kick the knight away with b4 or something like that. But rook e8, this is a very poor move. It weakens the f7 square, which, when that bishop is still on the a2 to g8 diagonal, rook e8 is often a dire error, because it weakens that severely. Bishop f4 just continues developing. Rook c8, this is getting closer to decisive error. Rook a d1, a6, I mean, this is all... Black isn't playing optimally here at all, but it's fairly typical for these structures. You'll notice this position, virtually everything is set for the d5 push for whites. Both of white's rooks are perfectly set up for the push. The bishop on a2 is set up for it. The knight on c3 is set up for it. Queen set up for it. Bishop and knight are both in the center ready for it. Literally every part of white's position is geared towards the d5 break. That's why I say over and over, black's first goal in every isolated queen pawn position is to take custody of the square in front of the isolated pawn. You have to control that square. If you don't control that square adequately, you'll get a position like this where white's just bulldozing through and breaking the position open with that pawn break. So, if you're fighting against the isolated pawn, always remember, keeping custody of that square in front of the pawn is one of your most important tasks, and then you can go on to other strategic goals. But a6, I mean, here, black almost had to do like an emergency knight d5 just to keep things bung-holed up. White's still much better, but a6, and then d5, of course. Knight x d5. And like he actually resigned here, which is not too soon. All of white's threats are completely overwhelming. White's just threatening bishop takes f7, then queen b3 check, and then winning the queen. Or he could even take an f7 and play queen x h7 and just try to checkmate black. Just one example line I gave, bishop f6. And this is going for black. Black's lost his queen, and he's going to lose even more because his king is still completely exposed. So, again, before we leave this line, I just want to stress again, this position, this is the sort of the paragon for a sort of position where white's entire game is geared around achieving d5. Literally every one of white's pieces is geared up for that pawn push. If black were to somehow take possession of the d5 square and stop that pawn break, suddenly a lot of white's pieces wouldn't make so much sense. You know, the bishop on a2 wouldn't make a lot of sense if the d5 weren't possible. The rook on d1 wouldn't make a lot of sense if d5 weren't possible. If black were more careful and took possession of that d5 square, that would make a lot of white's activity just completely non-existent, because it's that pawn break that brings all of white's pieces to life. So, just stress that again. That's, in my opinion, an important position to look at because it's so very typical for these sorts of isolated queen pawn positions. But that was all from that b6 line. That's an important subline to look at. So, as usual, I'll include the PGN note, annotated PGN file in the notes for the video. Take a look at that and give that some time. That's an important line to look at, both for theory's sake and schematically to understand the positions for yourself. But a6, a little bit less accurate in my opinion. Bishop a2, again, he takes the bishop out of the range of the knight a5 trick. b5, and this is the perfect moment for d5. And this is much more normal for what white tends to get from a d4-d5 position. He's not going to get a humongous attack necessarily out of this position. He's going to get a slightly better endgame, more or less. And that's completely fantastic. If you were an aggressive player, or if, say, you were a stronger player and you were afraid of going to a quiet endgame, maybe you could hold off on d5 here. But if you're a stronger player, you shouldn't be afraid of going to the endgame anyways, because that's usually where stronger players tend to be their strongest. But d5 absolutely makes sense here. Not only is white's knight and bishop sort of set up for it, the fact that black just played b5 sort of made this d5 to a8 diagonal weak. So achieving d5 at this very moment is a little bit stronger than otherwise. So d5, he takes. Knight x d5, this is very routine. Important resource for black here. Rook a7, it's a very nice resource, and it sort of lifts that rook into the game immediately to try to shore up white's position. Just a quick line that I have in the PGN notes. Queen c2, and this is a very typical position for what white tends to get from this. White is very nice here. White has the bishop pair. His bishop on a2 especially is extraordinarily strong. But he's got the bishop pair, he's got a little bit more activity. Black's not really done with the development just yet. This is very nice for white. It's not winning just yet. White has a lot of work left to be done. But this is very nice for white. This is the sort of position that you love to have if you play an isolated queen pawn. For rook a7 is strictly superior. Next, d5 is a bit too compliant. Queen takes. Bishop b7 was played in the game. I give another note on queen c7. I'll just leave most of it for the notes, but here queen e4 is devastating, just because black's position is so underdeveloped. Bishop f4 is going to come with tempo. White's just completely winning. Bishop b7, though, is the best move. And now queen h5. And this is very typical for these sorts of wide-open positions. The pawn structure is symmetrical. You know, it's 3 versus 3 on the king side. It's 2 versus 2 on the queen side. In these sorts of positions, it tends to be pieces, piece activity, and piece maneuvering that dictates your advantage. And here, white has a marked advantage just because his queen on h5 is so active, and his bishop on a2 is so incredibly strong. Basically, every white piece is better than its black counterpart. And in a symmetrical, wide-open position like this, where pawns really aren't a factor, it is piece activity and piece strength that matters the most. And here, white has a marked advantage, really due to those two pieces by themselves, the bishop on a2 and the queen on h5. That gives white a very powerful kingside initiative. Queen e6, this is a mistake. The best line for black, just a quickie, this is a little bit more tenacious. White is most certainly better, because now white has an incredibly strong bishop pair, and his dark square bishop is an absolute monster on the king side. But black could potentially hope to drive things away with, say, knight f5, or try to get counterplay for himself with something like queen c6. White is definitely better, but white still has to prove things. Queen d6 allows an almost direct kill. Bishop g5, he wants to achieve knight g5, so he's going to trade off the bishop on e7 first and then play knight g5. And when knight g5 comes, it hits f7 and h7, which is absolutely devastating. Rook a d8, again, trades it off, and then just simple chess. He goes ahead with his threat. Queen g6, queen x h7. So this has actually been played in the database quite a few times. This specific position has been reached many more times than just once. In my opinion, queen h7, it's a very safe move, and it definitely leads to a favorable endgame. It's not necessarily the best. In the PGN notes, which you can look at yourself, I'll just give the line that I think is best quickly. Right now, white is down a piece, but of course the rook on f7 is completely pinned, and that rook is going to be very strong for white. And this is just sort of the best line that I saw. This is definitely better for white. Usually 2 pieces against a rook is advantageous for the 2 pieces, but not in an endgame, and not when you have at least 2 pawns for it. White's going to win, at the very least, the pawn on a6, so he'll have 2 pawns to go with the rook. White's going to be able to create a passed a pawn, and that'll really stretch the coordination of black's 2 minor pieces. In my opinion, this should just be a losing endgame for black. But Queen h7 is the most popular choice in the database. And really, it's easy to understand why, because it just leads to a very simple winning endgame. Or not necessarily outright winning, but it's certainly favorable. This would not be a joy to defend as black. Rook x d5. I'm going to keep the analysis very light because I want to keep the video short, and it's beyond the realm of the IQP, but I do want to go over the moves quickly. F4 was a mistake. It sort of gave away black's counterplay, didn't actually achieve anything. H4 is a mistake. Rook c1. Just as a quick aside for rook endgames, activity is what matters. Don't let your rook sit passively on a square like a1. Even if it gives up a pawn, activate your rook. Activity is what matters the most in endgames, especially double rook endgames. Usually double rook endgames comes down to whoever can start marauding on the 2nd through 7th rank first. So rook c1 is definitely better here. And white's generating decisive threats. This is decisive activity. But h4, not the best. f3, mistake. Then I'll just go through the rest of do my marker Rubio Scotch for the day. Ooh, a Scotch is good for you. G5 just defends, and then liquidates to a winning endgame. And this is 2 pawns up for white, so this is completely gone. But again, the most important parts of the game were the opening parts, since we're focusing on the isolated queen pawns. This initial position, again, it's complex because black needs to balance these priorities. He needs to balance activating his light-squared bishop. He needs to balance protecting his outpost in d5. He needs to balance protecting his king side. That's a difficult job. You know, modern theory gives bishop f6. That is the best move. But even after that, black still has some opportunities to make things more interesting, like in this position. b6 is more effective than a6. And it's definitely still a game from here, even if white's a little bit more comfortable. So with that video, I think that's a good coverage of the d4-d5 theme. We're going to move on to... what do I do next? We'll do fun games. We'll do basic kingside attacking themes for whites. If black is able to keep control of the d5 point, then white sort of moves on to the next part, which is creating weaknesses on the king side and going for an outright attack on the king side. So we'll get to look at some flashy games, but they'll have sort of the logic of the game along with them. Apparently Jabava made an interesting opening theory. But that'll be for next video. My name is John Cole, also CyberTal. I'm going to see y'all later.